Everyone. All right, we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for your time and attending Grace and I's presentation today. Today, we're going to be talking to you about our research designing for diversity, responsive, flexible learning in a regional Australian ITE program. Really, our study is about looking at our pre-service teachers. We come from, of course, a regional teacher education context. Our students study a Bachelor of Education program, but we're very keen to understand a little bit more deeply our students' experiences of flexible learning and what kinds of flexibility support them to engage, access their learning, and to be successful. I just wanted to briefly flag that the research we're presenting today is part of a broader program of research where Grace and I have worked to conceptualise a responsible flexible learning framework for regional ITE programs. We've identified some really broad learner groups, some study preferences, barriers, and student progression needs. And the research that we're presenting you today really builds on that earlier work by looking a bit more closely at how and why different features of flexible learning shape students' engagement. I guess overall, our research is really aimed at informing more responsive and equitable program design for diverse pre-service teacher cohorts. Before we begin, I did want to briefly acknowledge country. Grace and I are coming to you from the lands of the Bindal and Walgarukuba peoples in North Queensland, but we do pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging and acknowledge that this has been a place of learning and innovation for many thousands of years. So just to start with a little bit of context for our research, I think we can all agree that flexible learning is a really important feature of higher education, of course, both Australian and internationally. And we undertook this research at a time at JCU in particular, where there were lots of conversations around being more flexible. And I think probably that term flexible was used and perhaps in quite a broad and uncritical way, if you like, and perhaps made some assumptions about what our pre-service teachers need. So I should clarify that these were broader conversations, not necessarily in teacher ed, but we're really keen to, I guess, dig a little bit deeper and unpack some of those assumptions and see whether flexibility actually works for a pre-service teacher contexts students. So for us, particularly in ITE, we know that we need to attract more students into teacher education. We need to retain and support those teachers so they can be successful and move into the profession. And those pre-service teachers come to us with some really varied backgrounds, varied educational backgrounds, employment, family commitments, geographic circumstances. And so there's quite a complex mix in terms of engaging them and preparing them to be effective teachers. So I mentioned that Grace and I are at James Cook University. So that's a regional uni in North Queensland, Australia. And it tends to be the case that regional universities serve a greater proportion of underrepresented groups, so particularly mature age students, first and family, First Nations pre-service teachers, and also students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So I guess while flexible learning is really broadly discussed across our institution and beyond, I think that we know relatively little about how different approaches of flexible learning actually work together across an IT program to shape diverse students' access and engagement. Now, Sarah mentioned in her talk this morning that flexible learning is usually framed as an equity measure because, particularly in Australia, where campuses are diverse, we've got a high proportion of regional, rural, remote campuses, metropolitan campuses. Flexibility can reduce the need for that regular campus attendance, so it can make higher ed more accessible for students who are balancing work, caring, and distance, of course, too. But we know that it's really important to acknowledge that access to learning is not enough. So there's quite strong evidence within the literature that the equity benefits of flexible learning can be compromised by, for example, technological barriers. Michael talked about the digital divide today, applying to both students but also pre-service teachers. Time poverty, poor online learning design, limited staff interaction, and feelings of students being isolated. So in view of this, we're really interested in understanding more deeply whether flexibility actually works to genuinely support diverse learners. So one useful study that we looked at quite closely was the work of Weller and Miles Keogh, who examined a B.Ed program model that combined intensive on-campus delivery with online delivery. Now, their research showed that responsivity, emotional security, flexible support, and supporting students at their point of need were most highly valued, among other things like assessment scaffolding, flexible tute options, and some really clear communication. What was interesting, though, that in this study, many students preferred face-to-face on-campus learning, and they found the independent or transition to independent online study really challenging. Again, this study was contextualized in the COVID pandemic. So the finding was really important to us because we often hear this rhetoric that, students want more online learning. But it suggested to us that flexibility needs to be more carefully designed. And this prior work, I guess in the context too of this prior work, it focused very much specifically on specific units, whereas we're looking more at a whole of program approach as well. So just briefly, that brings us to the rationale for our current study. So I've mentioned already that initial teacher education in regional contexts increasingly serves more diverse student cohorts. And while flexible learning is often considered an equity mechanism for diverse students, access to multiple modes of program delivery. So for us at JCU, and this might resonate with you as well, we have on-campus delivery, the traditional face-to-face. We have wholly online, which does have synchronous learning opportunities online. And we have mixed mode where students can switch between those two primary modes of learning. So having those multiple access modes of access doesn't automatically mean that students are engaged or successful. So our research question was, in what ways do structural flexibility, mode of delivery, assessment design, and support ecosystems influence and inform pre-service teachers' engagement with flexible learning at a regional Australian university? So really our aim here was to think about equity through responsive program design. Over to you, Grace.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Brilliant. Thank you. So in order for us to interrogate that research question, we used a convergent parallel mixed methods design. And so that involved having a survey which looked through a range of questions, I suppose, an open-ended and Likert scaled questions, trying to understand where our students are coming from in terms of what they need in flexible learning to best support them. We did both quantitative and qualitative analysis. So our quantitative analysis, we used SPSS and used both Kruskal-Wallis tests and also descriptive analysis just to get a better understanding of who our learners were and their needs in flexible learning. Also to understand a little bit more around their perceptions of what flexible learning means to them, what's working for them, what's not. But particularly for us, what was really interesting was being able to look at the data in a more granular way, identify the subgroups within that data, and for those subgroups, do we find patterns and trends for what works particularly well for them and what doesn't in terms of those flexible learning deliveries. We also looked at some qualitative data to help us better place or triangulate that quantitative work, and that involved analysing our open-ended responses, using NVivo and coming together collaboratively to identify those themes inductively. The three questions that we had on the survey for open-ended responses were, what are the flexible aspects of teaching, learning and assessment in the BEd that you appreciate most? What aspects of teaching, learning and assessment in the BEd are less flexible than you would like? And in your view, could anything be done to enhance the flexibility of the BEd for you? So when we looked through the data, we had 113 survey respondents from across our pre-service teachers. We did identify that over the time that the survey was open, it was open for 3 weeks. It was for all Bachelor of Education students. So those are students from 2020 onwards. We did have a 14.8% response rate. It would have been lovely to have a higher response rate, but knowing that it is a smaller response rate, we do still see it as very valuable data for us to understand at a program level what is working for our cohort. We were grateful too that we did get a response that covered a diverse range of our learners in the pre-service teaching BEd. So that did help us too when we looked at our cohort breakdown. There were 75 open responses also received, which we looked at inductively and thematized accordingly. And as I said before, quantitative analysis, looking at those Likert style responses, I did use the Kruskal-Wallis tests, looking at it numerically. So for our 5-point scale, Likert scale responses, looking at means, standard deviations, but also looking at differences in means between our different subgroups. And then for our qualitative analysis, again, looking at our transcriptions that we had there for the open-ended responses and coding those collaboratively. For our demographic breakdown, for those 113
That's
respondents.
on the previous slide. Sorry,
No,
Grace.
that was good. Perfect.
Okay.
Very seamless. We had across our courses, we had primary, secondary, and early childhood education. For those 113 respondents, you see over half of them were primary, 28% secondary, 13% ECE. Our ECE course, we should state, is an online course, and so that does accordingly affect some of the results that we see later in the presentation. For our entry pathways, we had students who were coming to university pretty much evenly spread across coming to university later in life, those who took a break after secondary, so a shorter break before coming back into study, and then school leavers, so our young school leavers coming straight from high school into university. And then for our modes of study, as Louisa discussed, we have those 3 different modes. So those who are studying entirely online, those who have face-to-face on campus study, and then those who have the mixed mode, so moving between both. We also looked at full-time work because that did affect some of the preferences for our learners. So we do have a majority of our students there you can see engaged in work, and full-time work is nearly a quarter of our respondents. We should also say too that our respondents were pretty evenly mixed between first, second, and third year of the BEd, but we had very few final year students. That was because the survey happened to land when they were on their final placement, so they're pretty busy at that time.
Thanks, Grace. So over to our findings now. So Grace mentioned that we really delved deeply into differences between different groups. And the interesting thing that our findings revealed was that there were some statistically significant differences across a number of our respondent characteristics. So including course specialisation, so early childhood, primary, secondary, their enrolment mode, their employment status, the reasons for choosing a particular study mode, and even their expectations of teaching and learning and approaches to learning independently. So students' qualitative responses helped us to unpack how and why these patterns might have emerged. And their comments were really interesting because they highlighted both flexible and less flexible aspects of teaching, learning, and assessment, and provided a bit of depth to our quantitative survey results. So you can see here on screen that 2 overarching themes emerged. So the first was around flexible learning design and delivery. So this refers to program level structural and technological decisions that shape students' access to synchronous learning. So I mentioned in our BEd, we have synchronous learning both on campus and online. And this includes workshop scheduling across different days and times, having classes that are offered outside standard working hours, attendance expectations, whether it's mandatory or not, and even the availability of workshop and lecture recordings. The second theme, personalised learning pathways, refers to students' capacity to tailor their own learning experience. And this is where flexibility really comes into its own. So this included self-paced online learning, having flexible assessment, providing students options around their study load and study mode, and of course, responsive support from teaching staff. So here are some brief examples of what students shared with us via their open-ended responses. So for example, around theme 1, students really valued choice around the structure of their learning, workshop scheduling, flexible attendance expectations, and having recorded sessions. These were particularly helpful when students had to manage competing commitments. And then under the second theme, students really talked about the value of self-paced learning. So particularly at JCU, we do have an LMS that has some really high quality asynchronous learning materials that are self-paced for students. Flexibility in their study load and their progression, choosing to take subjects and when and how many subjects. And I've mentioned already responsive support from staff. So I think what was clear from the data was that pre-service teachers' comments really emphasised that they were looking for the right balance of structure, flexibility, and support.
Yeah, so the quantitative findings really supported what we found with those themes that Louisa just spoke about. And when we looked at pre-service teachers' expectations of how they to learn to become effective teachers, we found here the rankings where one was best and 5 least effective for those ways to become effective teachers. We found there that the mean was the lowest for on-campus learning and assessment preparation. So that indicates that our students really are preferring to do that work with lecturers and peers in a synchronous manner. That was identified as on campus as well. But you'll notice there that the highest mean is for our independent online learning with no interaction. So online asynchronous learning, very unpopular. So our learners really do prefer to have synchronous contacts with lecturers and peers. And in between there, we see those other lower means again are for independent learning, but always with that interaction with lecturers and peers. We also found with the comparisons for the means that learning mode preferences were really important in terms of what students wanted to get out of their learning. So for our secondary ITE cohort particularly, they preferred on-campus learning compared to the primary and the ECE. The ECE being an online course isn't surprising, but it was interesting to see that secondary cohort really preferred to be on campus face-to-face. On campus and mixed mode students, so those students who had selected that as their preferred learning mode, did prefer the on-campus learning. They really wanted to get what they had signed up for in that sense. And again, our online learners preferred that online learning, but the synchronous aspect of that. We also saw that our recent school leavers, so they would be our students who've come out of high school, they preferred that on-campus learning, face-to-face, being able to build community with lecturers and peers. And that really supports that transition pedagogy, moving from a secondary space into a tertiary space and having a teaching structure that is similar to what they've come from. Whereas we found for our mature age students, they preferred that online synchronous learning. And that really suggests that flexibility around all of those other responsibilities that our mature age students have, work, care, responsibilities, etc. Having that flexibility with online learning. Students who preferred structured scaffolded learning, again, they were preferenced on-campus learning. So that really aligns with that idea of structure, pedagogies that support transition for those on-campus students. And our independent learners, those who identified themselves as independent learners, were preferable to having self-directed online learning, again, with that synchronous support. So very much the highlight there was that fully independent online learning is not something that any of our students particularly wanted, but that we need to take into account those things like educational background, even the course that they're doing. We didn't think that would really affect what our students would prefer, but yeah, that difference between our secondary cohort to primary and ECE was really interesting. But yeah, understanding that where our students come from in terms of that break they've taken between high school and university really affecting their preferred delivery mode was very interesting to us. And that helped us to, the next slide, yep.
Sorry, Grace.
That's all right. To put together a conceptual model for self-regulation versus structured learning. So that idea that we exist across that continuum. So for structured delivery, whether it's highly structured to highly autonomous, and the self-regulation if we're a learner who is quite able to self-regulate or needs a little bit more support. We found that in that lower left section there for our student profiles, those recent school leavers, those people who preferred on campus, they wanted that highly structured learning. They sit in that area there where they want that structured on-campus collaborative learning to build those skills. Then as we move through into students returning after a shorter break, they've got a little bit more of that confidence. a little bit more autonomy. So that's structured online learning. But again, with that inbuilt synchronous support, we identify as very important. Moving into our online preference students, they have that higher self-regulation because they could work online. So looking at structured responsive learning for those people, and those people or learners with strong self-management returning to study later in life, they want the flexibility. So having that self-directed online learning, but with synchronous opportunities built in is really important. Yeah. The next one. Similarly, for our pre-service teachers, perceptions of online learning, we saw a lot of positivity around online learning. All of those means there are quite low for being, which is positive, because that's for strongly agree, that they can manage their online learning. The really important one there was that it was important to have pre-recorded lectures online, and that makes sense for our students who want to be more flexible in when they access their learning. Yeah, next one. We did see again that students preferring on-campus learning were less positive about that online learning experience. They had a lower confidence overall, and they found that learning a bit more difficult. But again, those who preferred the independent online, more positive, more confidence, more motivation, and our mixed mode students sat in between those. So for our findings, again, really just summarizing, the mode that our students are selecting is really important to what they want, but also those educational backgrounds are really identified as a factor in what our students prefer in their flexible learning. And this led us to our other conceptual model, which was structured delivery continuum versus synchronous learning continuum. You'll notice there in the bottom right-hand corner in grey, independent online learning, no live interaction, consistently lowest ranked across the cohort. So our students do not want that. They want something with that synchronous component. We see there our recent school leavers, the on-campus collaborative learning is high real-time interaction, highly structured, moving through into that like transition pedagogy for them to support them into their learning, because a lot of those learners tend to be our recent school leavers. Our mixed mode preference students, they want that purposeful blended learning, those synchronous opportunities. And for those students who are returning later in life to study, again, self-directed online learning, high autonomy, but they do still want that real-time interaction with synchronous opportunity.
Thanks, Grace. So just to start to bring some of our findings together, I think our findings suggest that flexible learning works well when you've got program and delivery that aligns with pre-service teachers' learning needs and their expectations. So our findings were really interesting in that they show that different groups of students prefer different forms of support and modes of delivery, but most students very clearly valued synchronous live contact with lecturers and peers. So this really interesting counter narrative that students just want to learn on their own asynchronously. So the consistent finding across the study was that independent online learning was least preferred, and probably not surprising. We know that teaching is very much a relational profession, and so they probably have some very clear expectations around what learning to be a teacher is like, should be like, and that was certainly reflected in student survey responses. So as Grace flagged there, more recent school leavers generally needed more structure and scaffolding as they transition into higher education, whereas mature age and online learners particularly value higher levels of independent learning and autonomy, so that they can fit flexible study around their work, family, and other commitments. So we'd argue that flexibility requires a really coherent, thoughtful, and responsive options around learning pathways, and not just multiple modes of learning or indeed more online learning. So our study points, I think, to three key findings. So first, flexibility is really about aligning program delivery and students' needs and expectations, not just offering more online learning or more asynchronous learning. Secondly, it was very clear that synchronous learning opportunities are highly valued by our students and still matter, even for our independent learners, but it just needs to be accessible and responsive. And then finally, our third message is that equity very much depends on fit. So it was clear from students' responses that if delivery is poorly aligned with their particular circumstances or their motivations and readiness to learn, that their engagement tends to be compromised, even if you offer multiple modes of program delivery and different modes of enrolment are available. So just briefly to the implications for program design arising from our research. So we would suggest that on-campus students and more recent school leavers, or for those students, programs should really retain structured and scaffolded learning opportunities. As Grace mentioned, there should be strong transition support, so pointing to transition pedagogies, and gradual building of independent learning rather than assuming students arrive ready to engage, which really supports the findings of the Miles Makio study that we cited earlier on too. So for online mature age cohorts, programs should be well designed. They should include synchronous online learning alongside thoughtfully designed asynchronous self-paced learning, resources, recordings, and so forth. And it was very clear that students called for greater flexibility around scheduling of those synchronous learning opportunities, around their study load, so that they can fit the flexible learning around their regular commitments too. So just briefly, of course, as with any study, there are some limitations here. So we acknowledge that this is a cross-sectional study in a single institutional context, and we mentioned already with a relatively small sample. So we're certainly not intending that our findings are generalizable in a statistical sense. But I think what it does highlight is that it really does challenge some assumptions around perhaps what our pre-service teachers want and what flexibility means to them and what it means to us. And so we'd absolutely encourage research in more diverse ITE contexts. Future studies might track cohorts longitudinally. Now, we didn't examine academic outcomes, so it would be interesting perhaps to research that looks at that, particularly after implementing more profile-focused forms of flexibility. And as well, extending this research toward more pedagogy-first models of flexible ITE that explicitly connect program design choices and pedagogical design choices to student engagement and success. How are we going for time? Okay, we'll wrap up. There's our contact details there. Happy to share the reference list if you would like it, but we've got 2 minutes for some snappy questions if you'd like to ask anything. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks so much, Louisa and Grace. That was really insightful. It actually brought to mind some work that I've done previously around sort of student engagement rather than program flexibility. And I was wondering, with the findings that you had, what changes do you foresee making to your programs given the information you've gotten from the students?
Well, interesting, working in the politics of our own institution, and I'm not necessarily talking about education specifically, but part of this research I mentioned was this broader impetus to hold on to what's working well. So there is this kind of narrative, I think, creeping in that students want more asynchronous learning and more online learning. And we kind of knew in our bones, right, Grace, that well, students don't want that. And so part of our motivation was to actually have some empirical evidence to say that students do in fact value the synchronous and on-campus learning, but how does that look different for different cohorts? So yeah, there are some really tangible practical implications there around workshop scheduling. For example, that was a really big one. Lecture recordings, look, not new stuff, but really having some evidence to say that this is what our pre-service teachers want. And some interesting data around their perceptions of what makes an effective teacher. So we're kind of exploring both, as Sarah mentioned today, online learning for our pre-service teachers and their learning and development, but also, for their development too as pre-service teachers and effective educators in that context.
It's fabulous, thank you. And thanks also for sharing your conceptual frameworks. They were so easy to understand, and I could just relate, some of the work I've done and others have done to it really easily. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.